Robert, I think, has already given you ample introduction to this. What I would like to do today, this presentation actually is a summary of my latest book, which came out from Stanford University Press this last September in English, and deals with the relationship among Japan, China, and the Korean Peninsula. Particularly since the Asian financial crisis. So the last 10 years, the dynamics that we've seen over the last decade and the forces that are driving the future of Northeast Asia. Perhaps before, I do have a PowerPoint with which summarizes some of the main points and some of the main statistics that I hope will be useful as a basis for our discussion. Perhaps I should just say by way of preference of a general description that the argument is about deepening economic and political interaction among the nations among this triangle. That isn't to say, of course, that this is totally a matter of cooperation or cohesion, or that we're seeing the emergence of a European Union or a co-prosperity sphere of any kind among these three. But it is to document something which I think in the Western social science literature and even in the policy world, coming, having spent the last 7 years at SAIS in Washington, D.C., I'm quite struck with the myopia, particularly among the fraternity of U.S.-Japan specialists that I, consider myself a member of, and whose values, whose belief that the U.S.-Japan relationship is something tremendously important for the future, but that I find this is a series of considerations about how Northeast Asia is evolving that really isn't terribly well known among them, or more generally well known in Washington. And explaining exactly what is happening is complicated by the fact that Washington, at least, has a remarkably myopic or short-sighted view of history. And to the extent that it has it, it probably is an overgeneralized view that all the nations of Northeast Asia are at each other's throats or want to be, or that World War II hasn't ended and the occupation hasn't ended and things like that. And that isn't to depreciate the some bitter, of course, historical memories that do exist, or the ways in which political forces, I would say most particularly in China, but not exclusively there, have also perpetuated some of those memories. But it is to say that the meaning of history is changing, just as the pattern of economic interdependence is changing, and as demography is changing with the new generation that is beginning to look at some of these issues differently. Also, the domestic politics of the three countries in question are changing, all of which are issues that I look at in the book. The intellectual premise on which I'm arguing is that strategic calculation is not the only driver of national policy. I think that is something in the international relations literature that's almost, of course, in realist thinking, sort of classical realist thinking, it's a more or less a given. It's something in IR, it's very hard, of course, to integrate. If you're trying to talk about relations among nations, it's hard to go beyond thinking of them each as a single rational actor that has a set of calculations and they respond to the forces that they see and in a strategic sort of way. And the argument that I'm making is that that's quite an oversimplification. That in reality, economic forces, particularly in the kind of world that's emerging in East Asia, which is not like Cold War Europe, where the nations of the West faced a Soviet Union that was not integrated with them, that was static economically or declining. In the case of Northeast Asia, China or Korea and Japan, of course, face an economy which is extremely dynamic, one of the most rapidly growing in the world, with which they also have a strong degree and a rising degree of integration, which of course, like a relatively powerful magnet, pulls with much greater force, with a force that I don't think is generally recognized by a realist political theory. I'm arguing that economic forces, in short, are important, that regional competitive dynamics are as well, that supranational forces above the nation state can shape, constrain the way that nations actually behave or constrain their strategic actions. And also that the subnational forces within countries, be it their militaries, be it their political parties, be it their interest groups, their labor unions, or whatever, their bureaucracies even, as units in and of themselves, that those forces too are independent actors, and they often interact in a transnational way across borders, rather than simply waiting for some centralized national strategist to determine what ought to happen. So in the story that I would like to tell here, domestic politics, I believe, in these three countries are important, and I don't think that they're static in any of the three. And particularly in the case of China, the ways in which domestic political economy is changing, I think in the PRC, is something that has considerable consequence, not only for the making of Northeast Asia, but also for the global system as a whole. So with these considerations in mind, let me just go ahead and show a few slides that give you a more concrete idea of some of the arguments and some of the data that I'm using. And I'll try to do that in the next 20 minutes or so. One of the basic concepts that I start out with is the notion of the Shanghai Circle. The countries within about 2 hours flying time of Shanghai itself, which is, as you can see, well, as you can see, I don't have a pointer here, but right at the middle of this map here. And that circle, of course, it superintends a range of areas, of course, with very, very rapid economic growth, generally speaking, with also considerable political volatility, extending as far north as Harbin, as far west as Xi'an, as far south as Hong Kong, and of course, including the Taiwan Straits as one of the most dynamic elements in the entire Shanghai Circle, and then back up to the northeast, to the Korean Peninsula, and to Japan. Next slide. Northeast Asia, and here the core really is the Shanghai Circle, but these figures are for the three countries in question, or for Greater China, the PRC and Taiwan, Hong Kong, and then South Korea and Japan. But in population terms, you can see that they dwarf the other two major regions. The NAFTA, about 3 times the size of NAFTA, and about 5 times almost the size of the European Union in population terms. With lesser ratios in the other categories, but still, roughly speaking, comparable except for the population factor, on which, of course, Northeast Asia is much, much larger, which is to say as per capita consumption of energy, consumption of food, GDP begins to rise. Probably the running room that Northeast Asia has and the likelihood that it will cast a larger and larger shadow on the world is probably quite strong. Next slide. I think one of the arguments that I make and this is basically in relation to some of my colleagues in East Asian studies who talk what I think is in too general a manner about East Asia as a whole. It seems to me that talking about East Asia or East Asia in the Pacific, in a sense, obscures something which is quite important, which is happening in a narrower ambit, namely in Northeast Asia, among the three countries that I'm talking about. Those three, of course, traditionally have had very tortured, difficult relations with each other because of the Japanese occupation, because of World War II, and so on. They're a special case where the recent changes in demography and economics, it seems to me, have a particularly large impact that is of particular importance because of their overall scale within East Asia. Compared, as you can see by some of the figures here, along GDP, foreign exchange reserves, military expenditures, population, just a whole range of, basically across the range of major indicators. The heart of East Asia, what we always keep talking about as East Asia, is really Northeast Asia. It's both the area which is the most sophisticated technologically and the most heavily armed militarily and the most consequential economically. Southeast Asia, of course, important diplomatically. I don't mean to depreciate the importance of ASEAN in various contexts diplomatically, but it seems to me in political economic terms really the key question regarding the future of East Asia really lies in this smaller unit, Northeast Asia, which is the one that's in the process, I argue, of fateful change. Next slide. Okay, just a few words. I know I see some former students and some current students, and maybe a few of you as graduate students or young academics. So let me just say a word. I don't want to get this too heavily into IPE theory as to what I'm arguing here. But I do want you to believe or to have some sense of the broader, of the theoretical argument that lies behind this. There are enough commonalities, of course, across these major regions of the world that it seems to me it's meaningful to compare. But what is the driving force that transforms regions more generally, creates regions where previously you had only nations or amorphous subnational units? The argument is that crises, political, in some cases, security crises, like for example the Korean War, that had a fateful impact on the structure of Asia in creating the hub and spokes system by which the major countries, apart from those under embargo like China, were tied to Washington directly through the hub being Washington, but through the spokes of mutual security treaties. Korea, Japan, the Philippines, for many years Taiwan, for many years South Vietnam. This kind of a hub and spokes arrangement. Even from the 70s, it seems to me, and it was essentially an arrangement whereby you had economic advantages for the Asian partners, and then in return for security deference to the United States in the provision of bases and so on. The other kind of crisis that has caused major transformations has been economic crises. And in recent years, it has been especially the financial crises, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the financial crisis of 2008, that have been the major drivers of institutional change in East Asia, with also, of course, the Korean uncertainties regarding the nuclear situation in Korea also being an important driver. Interestingly, in deepening, among other things, military-to-military relations among countries like South Korea and the PRC, before the Cheongnan incident, of course, that had been traditional antagonists. Next slide. Well, here, these are some of the crises specifically that I look at. The Korean War, the Asian financial crisis, these many crises, the North Koreans, the Yasukuni Shrine. I think that had, ironically, an important role in deepening the working level networks of coordination, ultimately, between China and Japan. I think Tanaka Naoki must have at one point, he was working for Prime Minister Koizumi, and I said, well, hasn't Koizumi really, and are these tensions with China over the Yasukuni more or less cut off all of the dialogue between China and Japan? He said, absolutely not. And I was puzzled by this, and later I'll show you some of what happened during the years of the early 2000s. Even as Koizumi was prime minister. And then also the 2008 financial crisis. Next slide. A number of forces at work in transforming the region over the last 10 years. Some, the ideational dimension, cultural change, a lot of this, particularly between Korea and Japan, I think has been probably the most profound changes. Pop culture, education, tourism, trade and investment, corporate networks, all of these things have broadened. Another major aspect of what has been driving the making of Northeast Asia has been a declining dependence on the United States economically. You can see that in the case of Korea and Japan, dependence on the U.S. market really peaked in the mid-1980s during the Reagan years. And since then, it has steadily declined. For many years, of course, China's dependence was going the other way, which I think helps to explain the paradox of a regime that ideologically was in some strong tension or in political military terms with the United States, and yet was turned out to be relatively differential in terms of pushing some of its broader its political military interests and so on. You'll note here that the high point actually of Chinese dependence on the United States for export dependence was 2002. And after that, it declined. In the 2008 crisis. It rose again slightly, but it hasn't risen to the levels of 2002. And so, broadly speaking, even China's dependence on the United States has begun to decline, with, to my mind, probably significant long-term implications for foreign policy. China is more dependent on the East Asian region than it has been. It's also more dependent on domestic demand, with the importance of the West and the South, relations with ASEAN, pipelines through Myanmar to the sea, the pipelines to Kazakhstan and to and Turkmenistan, and as of January 1st, actually, the first of the Sino-Russian, or the Russian pipelines to China, the ESPO, was completed. And so there's a changing pattern in terms of China's own reliance on the broader world. Next slide. Within, the positive side in terms of the making of Northeast Asia, of course, is the rising dependence of all three of these countries on each other relative to their dependence on the United States. In South Korea, it was around the year 2000 that in trade with the other two passed trade with the United States. In Japan, it was a little bit later, around 2003. For Japanese exports, because of the long-standing dependence on the U.S., it was about 2007. This is an integrated imports and exports chart. And even in China, those internal trade has begun to rise more rapidly than trade with the US. And my argument would be also that exchange rate shifts in future could well intensify this trend. In other words, that as the dollar depreciates against the renminbi in particular, that internal expansion, that is developing domestic demand or export markets elsewhere in Asia, will become more important relative to exports to the US. And so that this trend of declining dependence on the United States is probably likely to intensify in future, if it's the case, and it seems to be almost certainly true, that the renminbi is undervalued at this point. Next slide. Now, maybe just a word, I don't want to be too redundant, I do want to get through so that we have plenty of time for discussion, but about cooperation and why it's driven by crises. It might seem a little paradoxical that if nations have tensions with each other, if it's versus a third party, perhaps it's easy to understand, but even if they have tensions with each other, for example, as across the Taiwan Straits, between Taiwan and the mainland, actually the tensions, the state of tensions themselves, over time has driven a very rapidly deepening interdependence that, to my mind, makes it quite increasingly unlikely that there will be conflict across the straits, a military conflict. In this cooperation, the Asian financial crisis, ASEAN +3, ultimately the East Asia Summit is the progression that we can see. South Korea's played quite an important catalytic role. If one looks particularly at President Kim Dae-jung's role after or during actually, amidst the Asian financial crisis of 1998, it seems to me that was quite important. Also recently, the role of President Lee in deepening ties, particularly with Japan. China has also made a series of initiatives. Maybe the one that's most striking, and to me has quite a bit of importance for the future of Northeast Asia, is the ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Agreement across the Taiwan Straits that was concluded last June between Taiwan and the mainland. Since the beginning of Expo, there's been, it was said to be temporary, but it appears that it's being extended, convertibility between the renminbi and the NT dollar. The investment, there are now roughly more than 200 flights a week across the straits between different locations in Taiwan and different locations on the mainland. Over 10% of Taiwan's workforce works on the mainland. $150 billion roughly of investment, Taiwanese investment on the mainland. And of course, since Ma Ying-jeou became president of Taiwan, an acceptance on the Taiwanese side also of deepening relationships. In Japan, I think probably the most, I'll get back to this point, I think the least, ambivalence, I think it's fair to say, of course, Japan being the one country in the region that has scale comparable to that in economic terms of China, more detached on the coast, insular, global. The United States-U.S.-Japan relationship being important. It's a somewhat different, it's a slightly different case. So the relationship going forward, it seems to me, and I am a strong believer in the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship, but it seems to me the magnetic forces operating on Japan, or certainly they're operating on Japan as well, in the economic sphere at least, to some degree. The networks that are beginning to emerge also across the region. The last point, the Boao Forum, the Jeju Forum in Korea, the Nikkei Forum in Japan, the Trilateral Summit. Since Fukuoka in 2008, there's been a trilateral summit among these three nations. And there's also this year, actually, a secretariat being established for the Trilateral Japan, China, Korea Summit, established in Incheon, that will be moving with the summit itself, but it's becoming more institutionalized. I have a couple of slides here, next slide, that show, to me rather dramatically, what has been happening. Now, I think this should be taken in context to say that there has been a proliferation of trilateral organizations, which basically, these are the organizations here along the left-hand side. The pattern of establishment, this shows you the breadth that they've begun to attain. The dates at which they were established are along the way. You can see them, and most of them have been continuous. They began really in the shadow of the Asian financial crisis. The very first that isn't on here, in 1998 at the Hanoi ASEAN +3 summit, there was a side meeting, a trilateral, among Japan, China, and Korea under Prime Minister Obuchi. And that was attached to that summit, to that broader Asian summit. In 2008, that link was dropped, so that now there's a trilateral, an independent trilateral, and from 2011 also an institutional apparatus to go with that. But as you can see, there's a whole series of meetings. They started with the environment, finance, economic and trade. If you look at 2006, that was when Prime Minister Koizumi left office. So before Prime Minister Koizumi left office, there were quite a large number, actually, of functional dialogues among the three that had developed. And then some of these also are continuing, although since the Chongnam and the Senkaku's issues, the pace of institutional innovation seems to have slowed, but it hasn't been arrested. Okay, over. Now, I'd like to say just a few words about what I think is happening domestically in the three countries, because the domestic changes, I think, are quite important in helping us to understand, and they suggest that there's something more than just national strategy, that national strategy doesn't give account adequately for this pattern of deepening interdependence and to some extent coordination, the establishment of new organizations for cooperation. Because realist theory would tell us that as China rises, we're going to see balancing behavior, we're going to see lots of ambivalence. And I should stress, certainly, the chart that I previously had showed, these are mostly on the economic side. I think that should be noted. And I'm not arguing that the alliances themselves are becoming less important. I do think in the absence of proactive steps to strengthen them and to reinforce them, that if they continue with the kind of drift that we have seen at some times among even the United States and Japan, that these dynamics become more challenging to, particularly to countries like Japan. Now, what is happening inside China, or what am I arguing? First of all, the Northeast, the big changes, it seems to me, really were set in motion with the advent of the Hu Jintao administration. Under Jiang Zemin, of course, personal antipathy toward Japan, wartime memories that were very direct for his own family, also proactive steps on the part of the United States, the Clinton administration toward China. I think there's a range of reasons for this, but under Chiang, relations with Japan were really quite rocky. For a variety of reasons, under Hu Jintao, they have begun to develop they did develop quite significantly, I would say, particularly between 2006, when Abe came to office, and 2010, I guess, the summer of 2010, the South China Sea issues, the Senkakus, and so on. Now, what's at work here? On the economic side, I think that broader integration within Greater China, where I mean across the straits, an important factor, I think, influencing China is the fact that they have succeeded in rather rapidly intensifying on terms that Beijing finds attractive, their relationships with Taiwan. And in this situation, particularly, this began even under Koizumi, they have been quite concerned about the backlash from Japan, and they put substantial diplomatic efforts into their relations with Japan. I think one can see this in the quality of the ambassadors, for example, that Beijing has sent to Tokyo. Wang Yi, for example, who is one of their the most, I suppose it's fair to say, one of the most polished and qualified diplomats that Beijing has had, who was here from around 2005, served as vice minister from 2005 to about 2008, helped to orchestrate the dramatic transition under Prime Minister Abe toward deeper relations with Tokyo. He's now head of the Taiwan Affairs Office that handles relations with Taiwan. So he's been given some of the most delicate responsibilities, and I think this also shows the linkage in Beijing's mind between relations with Japan and Taiwan and across Northeast Asia as well. The current ambassador also, I think it's worth noting, Ambassador Cheng Yonghua, is also has a broad range of backgrounds, has lived 17 years in Japan, is a graduate of Soka University, of course speaks very fluent Japanese, and was ambassador to Korea, also speaks Korean, and was ambassador to Seoul before he came here last year. So those kind of priorities in terms of the Hu Jintao administration. The Northeast development as one of the major initiatives of the administration, together with the Western development policies. In the context of Peaceful Rise, Zhang Bijan's Peaceful Rise strategy. So deepening relations, a orientation toward moving beyond the confrontation of the Shang era, and also the rising importance of a range of local politicians. Takes too much time to get into, but Li Keqiang, for example, Deputy Prime Minister, was governor of Liaoning Province. Also, the current mayor of Chongqing City, who under Xi Jinping is expected to be more prominent, from some of my friends in Chinese studies suggest, also has deep relations with both China, or both Japan and Korea. So the argument in any case that under Hu Jintao, political orientation toward Japan and Korea has shifted in a sharply positive direction from where it was previously. Next slide. On Japan, it seems to me the driver, again, I think Japan, no doubt, and many of you can speak more articulately to this than I think the dynamic is a more problematic and more ambivalent one toward China's rise. but the economic interdependence, the rise of that interdependence, the increasing importance of China economically is uncontestable. And I think this contrasts sharply to the relations between the EU and Europe during most of the Cold War, where Russia, of course, was not so attractive economically. It was quite static. But today's China, of course, is somewhat different than that. The political shift to DPJ rule, I should just raise that. It does seem to me, particularly in the Hatoyama year, that was very clear. With respect to Prime Minister Kan, it seems to me certainly the deepening of relations with Korea has been welcomed. Prime Minister Kan's statement on the 100th anniversary of colonial rule, a number of visits at various levels. Of course, Foreign Minister Maehara, Defense Minister Kitazawa, just recently, of course. That relationship, I think, is deepening very rapidly and has been recently the most important pillar of the Northeast Asian relationships to have deepened. And the political transition to DPJ rule, it doesn't seem to me certainly is the only factor, or that the LDP, many LDP politicians, of course, welcome that, certainly. But certain things that have happened, particularly regarding the historical issue, seem to me to have diffused a bit and to have given more momentum to Japan-Korea relations. Okay. In case of Korea, again, economic factors driving a deepening into relationships, trading and investment patterns that we talked about earlier. On the political military side, the uncertainties regarding North Korea. Sometimes you might suppose that the North Korean problem has driven these three countries apart. I would argue that certainly up until the Cheongnam, and even in spite of the Cheongnam incident, if you look at the larger picture, the changes have been more toward deepening networks, not the disappearance of political anxieties or the disappearance of alliances. I certainly don't want to suggest that. But certainly the deepening of a variety of networks to levels that were virtually unbelievable some time ago. The idea of a hotline between the Korean Air Force, for example, and the PLA, because of the uncertainties regarding North Korea. Political military dialogues. Certainly, of course, the deepening of dialogues with Japan. Just in the last week, as you know, the proposal by the Japanese side of an AXA agreement, an acquisition and services in crisis situations to provide food and fuel and so on to each other's militaries. It hasn't been signed, but that plus an intelligence agreement to me suggests a remarkable degree of deepening, even on the political military side. And also, of course, there's been there are scheduled to be some additional political military dialogues between China and Japan. Although I think it's important, and there have been ship visits, for example, that 5 years ago I think really could not easily have been contemplated. Again, not to say that old alliances are disappearing or becoming less important. In fact, they may be becoming more so. But to suggest that the lay of the land is shifting and that simply counting on old historical bitterness or the absence of communication or something like that to sustain the hubs and spokes across the Pacific, it seems to me that it could be an optimistic assumption in the absence of proactive steps. Next slide. Okay, just as I think there have been some changes, of course, in America's relationship with the Pacific. More interdependence, disappearance of some of the old trade tensions, the key point, I guess, that I would stress with respect to the U.S. and the making of Northeast Asia, it seems to me that given the importance of this trend, it's remarkable in a way that the American reaction has been as subdued as it is, or the lack of consciousness has been as pronounced as it is. And I suppose that I would account for that largely from the fact that the U.S. has been heavily preoccupied with, of course, the conflicts that it's been engaged in Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly. That said, certainly the developments since last June, Hillary Clinton's statements or speech in Hanoi last July, and a number of events that have happened since then, I think do, and particularly the emphasis of the United States on the U.S., Japan, Korea triangle. It seems to me that in the context of what I've said, that those really are quite important things. So that leads me into my conclusion here. I do think Northeast Asia is an increasingly coherent entity to an extent that at least Washington really doesn't appreciate in its fullness. Crises have played a major role in determining the political economic configuration of the region, and the Asian financial crisis of '98, the crisis of 2008, where of course China continued to grow even as the other major nations were in deep financial problems, have been changing the dynamic. This has been intensified by political changes in the three countries in question. China becoming, under Hu Jintao, more outward-reaching. Korea probably under the Kim Dae-jung starting it, No Mu-hyun administration as well, particularly becoming more oriented toward the mainland, and then those things largely remaining static during the Lee administration, which of course deepened them between Japan and Korea. Coordination among bureaucrats has intensified as interdependence has risen. Trilateral networks are intensifying. The long-run implications for global geopolitics, I do think, are likely significant, although they remain indeterminate, particularly because the response of the United States is not entirely and categorically, it seems to me, clear. It's developing, I think, in a direction. If we consider since last July or so, I think it's developing in a direction of responding to some of the most important dynamics I've outlined, particularly the stress that Secretary Gates had recently, and Admiral Mullen as well, on the Japan, Korea, U.S. Triangular relations, given that relations between Japan and Korea are proving to some extent that whole notion of some degree of deeper coordination, I think, may be becoming, I'd be interested in others' comments, but may be becoming more realistic. But essentially, if there really is a Japan, China, Korea relationship that's gaining some significant momentum and some institutionalized role, it isn't necessarily a negative thing. I don't think the United States should categorically look at it that way. However, it does require some sort of proactive steps to reinforce the role of the United States in the region along the lines of the U.S.-Japan, Korea triangular relationship becoming more important significantly than if the events of the last 10 years had not deepened those ties within Asia itself. The U.S.-Korea economic agreement, of course, President Obama is committed to passing that, in that could have adverse implications for Japan. It seems to me Japan's involvement with the TPP and active efforts toward agricultural reform, particularly. Those are more strategically important, I think, than many people in Japan appreciate. And from that point of view, it seems to me Prime Minister Kan was probably farsighted and courageous in appointing Kaidabanu as VT minister, in configuring his cabinet in such a way that on some of these issues that have broader global implications that Japan hopefully may be able to move forward. America's interactions with Northeast Asia will likely influence, I think, there's no question, just as historically over the years they have, the emergence of the region. But with the making of Northeast Asia, I think at last we're moving into an era when the ultimate configuration of Northeast Asia's relations with the world are much more a matter of decision within the region than they have been previously. So that is what I basically wanted to say, and I look forward to all the brick bats and stones and whatever you have.
Thank you.